This is Let the Record Show, using common sense. Now, here are your hosts, Judge Richard Weinberg and Chairman Jesse Garcia.
Welcome back to Let the Record Show with Chairman Jesse Garcia of the Republican Party. Jesse is the Vice Chair of the New York State Republican Party and also the Suffolk County Republican Party Chair. Joining us later for our third segment will be our good friend, Eric Levine, noted commentator, essayist, and attorney. He's literally on the train down to Washington for meetings. And in that final segment, we're going to be having Peter Rough, a pretty rough, R-O-U-G-H, who's a senior fellow director, the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the world-famous Hudson Institute. Most notably, he was a director of research in the office of President George Bush. He was Associate Director, White House Office of Strategic Initiatives, and helped President Bush write his autobiography. And he's an expert on foreign policy, national security, and Europe and Eurasia. And we'll be having him in our final segment. So, Jesse, it's very, very funny because I get very frustrated as I see what's happening across the country and across the world. So let me tell you, and we'll obviously be talking in the last segment more about the problem with Russia and the Ukraine. But let me give you my thoughts. I think President Trump is so concerned with making deals that he's missing what's at stake here. And my view, as I've said before to you and to Eric and to other guests, is no deal is much better than a bad deal. We had a bad deal when they established the Iranian JCPOA, which allowed the Ayatollahs in Iran to keep building missiles, to keep doing work with nuclear fission, to fund terrorists. A big mistake, a deal that never should have been made, and Trump, to his credit, unraveled that in his first term. And I'm very hopeful that he'll recognize that you cannot make a deal with the Ayatollahs. They are dedicated to the destruction of Israel, the United States, and Western civilization. As our friend Eric would say, they are trying to unravel the balance of power, and they have a view of domination of their Islamist fundamentalist ideology, which is both bottomed on religious text as well as political text. Now, those people believe that they misread the religious text. We can debate that, but the fact is they justify what they're doing as a religious crusade. For them, this is a crusade. Trump keeps trying to get them to make a deal. When is he going to take no for an answer? When is the President of the United States and his advisors going to understand that he's negotiating against himself? For a man who views himself as a master of the deal, of the master of the art of the deal, anybody who does any negotiation knows you do not negotiate against yourself. And that's exactly what he's doing now. He's negotiating against himself. You cannot allow any enrichment at all, and you cannot go along with the pretext that it's only for civilian use, because the danger of that, Jesse, is that it's easily converted to military use. You cannot trust them not to hide it. You cannot trust the UN inspectors to get to the truth of it. You cannot trust either the Israeli or the American intelligence services to ferret it out and to really know when they've made the corner and they've now weaponized their nuclear program. You cannot trust that. As we talked about last week, you have the Austrian, the German, and even the UN inspectors are now recognizing that Iran is moving perilously close. It could be days or weeks and maybe months away from them being nuclear armed. If that happens, the whole world changes. So, my view about this, he's got to rethink what he's doing with respect to this Iran situation. He's got to take no for an answer. He's got to stop standing in the way of Israel. To Israel, this is an existential crisis. One last thought before I turn it over for your analysis, Jesse. This is not Israel's war. Israel is just the first step in this war of hegemony by this Islamist, fundamentalist death cult in Iran. After they take out Israel, which is the first barrier for Western civilization, they'll be moving in to Europe, which is now weakened and is being overrun by illegal immigration, and they'll turn their sights on us. This is serious business. We rely on Israel as a military buffer, an intelligence buffer, and a source of technology. So I've thrown a lot at you, Jesse. Your turn.
Thank you, Your Honor. It's a pleasure to be here again on a Sunday morning with you, and I await our friend Eric Levine. I guess we'll save Russia and whatnot for Peter Ruff later in the show. But just to pick up a couple of things that you said, and I know that we're going to also touch base on the WHO. But speaking about the Iran deal, I think if you look at everything cumulatively in foreign policy, you can see a growing list of frustration that is undergoing the Trump administration there, where it comes to Russia and Ukraine and a peace deal, the Iran and the Ayatollahs on nuclear enrichment, and so on and so forth, and dealing with China. And I know the president had what he described as a productive conversation for about an hour and 15 minutes with President Xi of China earlier this week. But speaking specifically about an Iran deal, I understand that our president is a deal maker. But I also understand that I think that he is exhausting every opportunity to use a pause for the benefit of the United States and her allies like Israel, and also a pause for a country, our nation, that is war weary. After almost 25 years of the war on terror, after incursions and occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan, the American people have spoken that they want our American boys and women to stay home, to fight wars that are productive and constructive for the preservation of our national security and our domestic security. Now, I do agree that the United States, being the great superpower here on the globe, needs to carry a big stick, and it needs to show its force and not retreat itself from venues, whether it's the Middle East or the Ukraine region, Europe, China, because that vacuum will be filled with the new members of the axis of evil, Iran, Hamas, North Korea, Russia, China, Venezuela. We've seen that disastrous policy take place, unfold before our eyes during the Biden administration, where now the Monroe Doctrine doesn't even exist. We have communist China inside of Cuba. We have Iran in Venezuela. So they're in the northern and western hemisphere right now for us. So as it comes to Iran, the president, I do believe, is using this because of two reasons. Number one, we are war weary in the United States. We need to replenish ourselves to be the war fighters that we are. We need to redirect the Department of Defense after being woke and DEI for 4 years. We have to redirect that agency and all of our war fighters. Also, our dear Israeli allies, they needed a pause as they need to replenish arms, munitions, their replenish and rest their soldiers. But I think that one of the things that's happening here is that the president has said straight up, there is no enrichment of uranium for military, for civilian. It's not good. If there is a need for a nuclear enrichment or nuclear power in Iran or other countries, we can do it the way we normally do it with the 9 other, nuclear nations. And that's, we provide the uranium, we take it back. And when it's for civilian use, that's when it's at a minimal level. Now, listen, Iran has rejected 100% of their no uranium enrichment. This is something that needs to be a focus point because Israel and the United States must be together on this when it comes to Iran. The Middle East wants Iran denied nuclear weapons and defanged, as they are the funding source for proxy wars, not just against the United States, where hundreds of our servicemen have been attacked by their proxies, but also they fund Hamas and they fund other terrorist groups in the area, the Houthis and so on and so forth. But one thing that I read that is alarming, and I hope it's alarming to those counseling the president, is Iran views having nuclear capabilities as national pride. That is, for me, scary, because that is a dog whistle for they want to use it for force, for power, to expand their Iranian empire, as opposed to doing more for civilian uses. Iran sits on one of the largest resources of oil and natural gas. Why they need nuclear, I do not know. I reject their premise that they require it. Their economy would grow if they were returned to our community of nations and stop their terror acts and stop with their human rights violations and stop attacking and calling Israel the little Satan and the United States the big Satan. So I really do think that anything that needs to move forward with Iran, and we understand that it's going to be Israel that's going to be the point of the spear on that. We need to do it together. We need to do it as allies. And once and for all, let's rid ourselves of this regime in Iran so it never can threaten those who respect and honor and love freedom and liberty in that region or anywhere in the globe.
That's very well said. This is the problem, as I see it, Jesse. We've been chasing the illusion that a deal can be made and we can bring in Iran under the leadership of the Ayatollahs into the community of nations, and that their values and their interests and their concerns are like any other rational society, that they want trade, they want a good economy, they want a high quality life, they want to be able to take care of their people, and they want to have good relationships with their neighbors. That's been the illusion. There's always been the view that somehow, some way, you can cut a deal with them and we'll make up, we'll have a kumbaya moment, and then we can move on. But that's not what you have there. What you have there is you have a whole different world view. And the big mistake is the naivete that submits that they're just another nation state that wants to be respected. And if you cut a good enough deal and you show them enough respect and you give them enough resources, everything will be fine and there'll be peace evermore, and they'll act in their rational self-interest. It's not in their rational self-interest when they believe that there's no such thing as a rational self-interest. They are fundamentalists. They are a death cult. They are people who believe that if they wipe Israel off the face of the earth, it's not a big problem. They've said so because there are a lot more of their crew, the Muslim community, than there are the Israelis and the Jewish community. So you wipe them off, they'll still survive, and they'll just replenish themselves. That's the mistake. This is not the traditional mutual assured deterrence. This is not the way where you cut a deal and it's in everybody's interest to abide by the deal. What do we know about their culture? We know that they lie. We know that they cheat. We know that they steal. They have a culture that glorifies in lying and conning a deal. So any deal that's made has to be enforced. Now, how do you enforce that? You enforce that by inspections. But you can only get inspections if they let you go in. And they would bring people in, but they would limit their access to the real sites. And then they start burying them underground. So when you start burying them underground, that means they're hiding something. And we don't know all the sites. So the question becomes, what does the United States have to do? And what does Israel have to do? There should be, as you correctly point out, Jesse, there should be a convergence of interests on the part of the United States and Israel. But ultimately, in the immediate problem, is it's more of an existential threat to Israel than is to America. Ultimately, it will be an existential threat to America, but right now, the first one up is Israel. Israel cannot allow this to happen because if these folks have nuclear weaponry and the delivery systems to do it and the money to fund terrorist networks, they will use them. This is a never-ending war for them, and you'll never be able, with that regime, to make a peace deal. If that regime was gone and you had a civilian government that were not obsessed with the hegemony of their cult, that would be a different story. This is Let the Record Show with Chairman Jesse Garcia of the Republican Party. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg. Please stay with us. We'll be right back in a few moments with more interesting conversation on Let the Record Show. Please stay tuned.
Let the Record Show is on the air.
If you work as a manufacturing facilities engineer, installing a new piece of equipment can be as complex as the machinery itself. From prep work to alignment and testing, it's your team's job to put it all together. That's why it's good to have Grainger on your side. With industrial-grade products and next-day delivery, Grainger helps ensure you have everything you need close at hand through every step of the installation. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
This is Let the Record Show, using common sense. Now, here are your hosts, Judge Richard Weinberg and Chairman Jesse Garcia.
Welcome back to Let the Record Show with Chairman Jesse Garcia of the Republican Party. Jesse is the vice chair of the New York State Republican Party, as well as being the chair of the Suffolk County Republican Party. Our good friend and esteemed colleague, noted attorney, commentator, and essayist Eric Levine, is on a train to Washington, D.C. Hopefully he'll get to his hotel in time so that Eric will be able to join us for the third and final segment of today's show. We're looking forward to having a guest, Peter Ruff or Peter Rowe. I've never met the gentleman, but we'll be talking to him. He's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He's the director of the Center of Europe and Eurasia. He's an expert on national security, defense policy, foreign policy. He was a senior advisor to President George W. Bush, where he's the Associate Director of the White House Office of Strategic Initiatives. And he also was the assistant to President Bush when President Bush wrote his biography, his memoir, Decision Points. He's a noted commentator, essayist, and we'll be speaking with him now, a third segment, and hopefully he'll be on and Eric will be able to join us. So I want to talk to you, Jesse, about something that really concerns me. And I think the vast majority of people listening to this show, nationwide, internationally, don't even know this problem exists. I came across an article, and I saw that. And I must tell you, Jesse, my eyes started to bleed and my head exploded. Why? Because the World Health Organization is making a power grab. And what is that power grab? It's dangerous for the world and national sovereignty of nation states. It must be stopped. What is that problem, Jesse? That problem is as simple and as dangerous as this. If people who are members of the World Health Organization do not opt out of this program, when the World Health Organization announces that there is an international health crisis, then every nation state has to abide by the pronouncements, determinations, the policies, the rules of the game set by WHO. Now, what's my problem with the WHO? It's bought and paid for by the Red Chinese. They covered for the Red Chinese forever during the COVID crisis. They never gave you an honest answer about what they knew or didn't know with respect to the origins of the COVID crisis. And in fact, when they should have been saying it's absolutely ridiculous and impossible to say it came out of a wet market, they covered for it because everybody knew it really came out of the lab in Wuhan. And anybody who didn't believe it came out of a Wuhan lab, where they were doing experiments with this virus, which was protected by and defended by Chinese military, if they don't believe that this was coming out of that lab, then they're fools. Of course it came out of that. And you'd expect better from the World Health Organization, which is supposed to be an independent entity. It is not an independent entity. It is controlled by the Red Chinese, no friends of this country or of Western civilization. Your thoughts, Jesse?
I agree with you, and I'm heartened that President Trump, upon his second inaugural, issued an executive order withdrawing U.S. and the United States from the WHO, withdrawing funding from there. And you're absolutely right. Let's understand it. The WHO is a fraud organization. It is in bed with the enemies of freedom in the United States, it's almost like the United Nations. And those enemies are like China. And like we know, the UN always seems to side and move towards against freedom-loving republics like the United States and Israel. China purchased its responsibility for COVID out of the World Health Organization. They did that, and it is right and just for the United States to continue down the path to not be shackled by any of the orders or any of this power grab that you described by the WHO. It did not work for us before. It will not work for us again. It was wrong for Biden, who went on his own version of the Obama apology tour following his inaugural in 2021 by returning the United States to the World WHO. For myself, and I think for the best of those who believe in freedom, liberty, and the science, I would rather rely on the United States innovation, ingenuity, and its research. Let's not forget that what stopped and curbed COVID was Operation Warp Speed on getting a vaccine to COVID to the people at a fast rate. It was one of the things we needed to be done. President Trump did not receive the accolades for getting that done. And I always find it ironic that it was announced that the vaccine was ready to be used a week after the 2020 elections. But it was only degraded and derated when the Democrats locally, in the state, and nationally mandated the EVs, basically creating mandated the vaccines like they mandated electric vehicles, or they mandated that we can't use natural gas or oil to use in our stoves anymore. Whenever you mandate something, the American people are going to revolt. Anybody who has a conscience or free will is going to revolt. So from my perspective, I'm with you. We should opt out. We should not be involved with the WHO. This is nothing more than an arm of America's enemies, like China.
Well said. So let's switch gears. I want to talk about something else that I find deeply troubling. This is the intifada cancer that's now here in America. This is a call for worldwide revolution. This is a culture that glorifies violence. Their rhetoric is actually a proximate cause of violence, and it encourages lunatic fringes to violent activity. It's part and parcel of what they want to do. You cannot say, well, you really can't blame the rhetoric because that's incidental. The violence is incidental to rhetoric. No, the violence is part and parcel of their value system, their goals, their operating manuals, their agenda. Intifada is a word that means worldwide revolution. They are there to destabilize and to dominate and to control any nation that stands in their way for their hegemonic dreams. And they have brought this to the United States of America. They have used infiltrators. They're bought and paid for. You have professional agitators who are working to destabilize this country, Jesse. And I tell you something. Look at what's happened just recently. One clown tried to burn down the governor's mansion of Governor Shapiro, a Jewish American, the governor of the state of Pennsylvania. Then two people, one Christian, one Jewish, a couple about to be engaged, come out of a meeting of the Holocaust Museum, the Israeli Museum in Washington.
Washington.
They're gunned down, Jesse. Gunned down. And what was the purpose of the meeting? To try to get more humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza, and to make sure that that aid was not subverted by Hamas, which is using it for its own vision of controlling the population in Gaza. And they were gunned down. They were well-meaning people, and they were killed. And that was the purpose of the meeting, and they were killed for their efforts. Why? Because they were perceived to be the enemy, Jews. So that's bad enough. And this is not, again, these are not random acts. This is what people have to understand. It's a series of acts that flow out of this call for a worldwide revolution, for jihad, for violence against anybody they perceive to be the enemies. So what happens now? You go to Boulder, Colorado. And Boulder, Colorado, some savage who shouldn't even be in this country because he came here on a visitor's visa, he should have been picked up and thrown out. He overstayed his visa. He overstayed his visa, Jesse. He should have been removed. That blood is on the hands of the Biden administration and Mayorkas, the Homeland Secretary. These people should have been removed. They had no right to be here. There is no right to overstay your visa. A visa is permission. It's a privilege. They should have been picked up and removed. The due process means you're picked up and you're put on a plane back to your native land. That's your due process. You don't have hearings. You don't have court proceedings going on for years. You are picked up as a matter of right by the government of the United States, as Secretary of State Rubio has pointed out, and you get them the hell out of our country. They don't belong here. But no, the left wing, the apologists, let them stay. And these people, I don't know, 16 or 18 of them, they were firebombed. Some are still in the hospital, critically wounded. It's just a miracle no one has died yet from this attack. He said he would do it over and over and over again, and that intifada and jihad was more important to him than his wife or his children, most important thing in his life. And that's what we let roam the streets of the United States. That cancer is here. That cancer is dangerous. And if we don't take charge, Jesse, we're going to lose America. It's time to wake up, smell the coffee, and understand that the monsters are amongst us. What do you say?
I once again, Your Honor, agree with you. And this intifada, this cancer is here. As you pointed out, they are paid antagonists and agitators. They want to foster anti-Semitism and foster division amongst our ranks. And why? And I make this akin to the groups like Antifa and BLM, who in 2020 were allowed to violently protest, to occupy and take over municipal buildings. They were allowed to conduct violence, and no action was taken to them amongst some of our cities and urban centers, and of course, in the Department of Justice led by the Biden administration's Department of Justice and FBI. The same Department of Justice and FBI, of course, that went after parents who had the audacity to question the school board and what the curriculums they were teaching in their classes to their kids. These are groups that, as you said, are now among us. And how come they're among us? And why do they feel the ability, the freedom to spout anti-Semitism, racism, divisiveness in our country? Because for 4 years, the woke, progressive Democrats led this nation, opened up the doors to anyone, and took no action against violent protesters and anti-Semitism. They let it occur in our city streets. They let it occur in our campuses. In fact, they allowed it to flourish in our campuses. Not only Democrat elected officials, but the elitist academia of these colleges and universities that allowed these individuals who don't belong on their campuses to trespass on their campuses and then put it in danger the lives of their own students who pay tuition to there. And in some cases, those students weren't even able to go to their classes. We saw this at Columbia. We've seen this at Yale. We've seen this at various other universities throughout our nation.
Cornell, UCLA,
Cornell.
University
And
of
what is the Department
Michigan,
of Justice?
Columbia.
And what is the Department of Justice? Where was the FBI? Nowhere. They went after parents who were questioning school board members. They allowed this to fester. They allowed it to grow. They allowed it to take some root in our communities. Now we have to rip this. We have to rip this anti-Semitism, this racism, from its roots and out of our nation.
Well, the question becomes, what's to be done? Now, Trump, to his credit, and for this I'm deeply grateful for the leadership of the President of the United States, what he's done is he's closed our border. So Biden, who made a big point of saying, I need legislation, I can't do it, and lied to the American people, and his Homeland Secretary, Mayorkas, lied to the American people, and all the so-called border experts lied to the American people.
And the mainstream media amplified that lie.
That's right, exactly right. And what happened? He closed it down. But this is the problem. You had all these people who came in here who were not sufficiently vetted. You're trying to round them up and get them out of here. You're talking about millions of people. You have the getaways or the runaways or whatever you want to call them. They're the ones you don't even know about because there was no registration. He violated, that is, Biden and Mayorkas violated the immigration laws and their obligation to protect and defend this country because they didn't vet them. They blew up on the day one of his administration, Biden did, the Remain in Mexico policy. So they came scurrying through the border. And they were trafficked by the cartels who made money out of it. They were trafficking, human trafficking, child predators, fentanyl, which is killing 100,000 of our people a year. This and in league with the Chinese and the Mexican gangs. So this, and then you had all these gangs coming in here, which are overrun urban areas all across this country. The disaster is enormous. So what does Trump try to do? He tries to get them the hell out of here, as he should. And what do? They go to court. And they sue, and just on these families, what Trump is saying, and the Homeland and Justice Department saying, get out of here, you don't belong here, you're here on a visa, you have overstayed, you're out of here. Some federal judge issues a temporary restraining order saying, you can't do that, and we'll put this in hearings. This judge should read the Constitution of the United States. This judge should read the immigration laws. This judge should abide by the determination of the Secretary of State, Rubio, that people like that who overstay their visa have to leave. This is Let the Record Show with Chairman Jesse Garcia of the Republican Party. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg. Please stay with us. We'll be back in a few moments. Hopefully we'll be able to connect with our good friend Eric Levine, noted commentator, essayist, and attorney, and with Peter Roth, or Rowe, I will find out before he comes on air, who is the director of the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the world-famous Hudson Institute, a leader in the George W. Bush presidency at the White House, where he was the associate director of the White House Office for Strategic Initiatives, and helped President Bush write his well-recognized memoir, Decision Points. We'll be back in a little while. I will turn our focus to Russia and to the Ukraine. Please stay with us.
Let the Record Show is on the air. This is Let the Record Show, using common sense. Now, here are your hosts, Judge Richard Weinberg and Chairman Jesse Garcia.
Welcome back to Let the Record Show with Chairman Jesse Garcia of the Republican Party. Jesse is the Vice Chair of the New York State Republican Party and County Chair of the Suffolk Republican Party. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg. Eric Levine is in transit. Hopefully he'll be phoning in to join us. And we're honored and privileged today to have a very special guest, Peter Rowe, the Senior Fellow and Director of the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute, a world-renowned think tank. He's an expert on national security and defense and foreign policy. He led the office, or was the Associate Director of the White House Office of Strategic Initiatives with President Bush. Additionally, he helped President Bush with the well-regarded memoir, Decision Points. Mr. Rowe, we're honestly delighted to have somebody of your expertise joining us on today's Let the Record Show. Thank you for being here.
The pleasure's all mine. Thanks for having me, guys.
So, let me start off with my thesis, and then I want your comments. And I want the focus to be on Russia-Ukraine or Ukraine-Russia. I have the view that it's time for Trump to take no for an answer, that Trump's administration has to really rethink what it's doing and it has to move quickly and decisively. There are too many threats out there and too little effective responses. It's nice to negotiate. It's nice to have diplomatic conversations. But when the other guys are using that to play you, to stretch out the clock and keep doing harm, it's time to do something about it. In the case of Russia and Ukraine, this war was started by Russia, not by Ukraine. This war has decimated the country of Ukraine, yet they fight back. And just recently, they had successful attacks by taking out about 40 of the planes that were important carriers for the Russian military effort against the Ukrainian people, as well as disabling that bridge, which is a connector between Crimea and Russia. And Putin and his foreign minister and his mouthpieces and his former president, whose name Medvedev, I guess it is, saying this was an act of terrorism, this is awful, they've just raised the stakes. Now, what would you have Ukraine do? What should the United States do? And where are we? Mr. Rowe, we're all ears.
Well, thanks. It takes me back to, I think it was a quote ascribed to Lenin, and it may be apocryphal, but I think it's true. And that is, you probe with bayonets. If you find mush, you push. If you find steel, you withdraw. And that really is the Russian way of grand strategy and diplomacy, which is that they look for weakness, probe for weakness, and try to take advantage and exploit any signs of weakness. So I think you're right that paradoxically, to really get a resolution to the war, you probably have to show some steel. You probably have to be prepared to say no, and let the Russians recognize that there are limits to how far they can go. Now, I think the president's been hesitant to go the sanctions track in particular because he's worried about, number one, souring the negotiating climate, and number two, he doesn't think necessarily that this will change Putin's calculus fundamentally on the war. But in the end, if you really want a negotiated solution, I think that hitting the Russians, pushing sanctions forward, might actually engender some seriousness in Moscow. And then secondly, even if it doesn't fundamentally change how Putin thinks about the war, it weakens Russia. And the slow and steady weakening of the Russians, I think, is in the American interest. So we're probably at an impasse. I think the administration realizes it's at an impasse in its diplomatic initiative. They've moved from what they've kind of described as shuttle diplomacy, where they have Ambassador Witkoff going to Moscow and General Kellogg going to talk to the Ukrainians. And they've now kind of forced the two parties, the Russians and the Ukrainians, together directly and trying to step back themselves, the U.S., that is. And I think they're searching about and trying to figure out what the next step is. But Trump doesn't seem to have given up yet on the negotiating track. But, he's musing aloud now that it might not be working and that Trump and Putin, in his words, might be tapping him along.
Well, this is the problem. Number one, I pick up the Wall Street Journal Thursday's Wall Street Journal, and the lead article is about moving defensive technology that stops drones, moving it away from the Ukraine and moving it to the Middle East. So the question becomes, why is the administration doing that? It's because we don't have enough military resources to give to both Ukraine and to our allies in the Middle East against a potential attack by Iran? Is it because they're so annoyed at the government of Ukraine that they're trying to punish them, and this is some sort of retribution? And if we don't have enough to supply both arenas, doesn't that say something really terrible about our preparedness to meet the challenges that confront us? And by the way, one more thought, then I turn it back to you. Why has all the pressure seemed to have been on Zelensky and on Ukraine when the aggressor is Russia? Your thoughts, sir?
Well, I don't think that decision was meant to punish the Ukrainians. At least I didn't interpret it as such. I think it's probably a matter of resource scarcity and the basic problem that the Iran issue is coming to a boil, and the administration is preparing for contingencies should negotiations fail with the Iranians. But it does get at the larger point, which you just hinted at or even made explicitly, which is that our defense industrial base really has grown weak over the years. There are many choke points in it, and we're not really prepared for multiple contingencies anymore the way we once were. And so it's become very difficult in our defense industrial base to have enough interceptors for, say, a Guam war scenario, Patriot interceptors, and at the same time send them to Ukraine so that they can defend their cities. It's real homework that we have to do, and I think something we have to address. And in a way, a lot of the investments that have been made to help Ukraine, defense supplementals here at home, have gone to building up our defense production, because in war, what matters is to have production capacity more so even than stockpiles. And maybe just one quick digression on that. I recently read that in 1916, the French army fired its entire pre-war artillery stockpile in 1 month. In 1918, the German army in World War I, which had the largest pre-war stockpile, fired its entire artillery stockpile in 2.5 months. So what matters is not how many pieces of munition you have in warehouses, but how quickly you can build out your production if war eventually comes. And in a way, the Ukraine war, as awful as it is, has given us an opportunity to build out our production capacity if only we'll use it and seize it. And to date, we've done some of that, but we need to do more. As to the pressure, there's truth in that. Of course, we are fundamentally on the side of the Ukrainians, and so there are sanctions in place and there are weapons that are flowing to Ukraine. And so in that sense, we have chosen sides. I mean, we are supplying ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, to the Ukrainians. We're not doing that for the Russians, of course. But there is a good argument to be made that now is the time, having tried this diplomatic track, having reached out a hand to the Russians and trying to get them to shut down the war, that the president's realizing maybe Vladimir Putin doesn't just follow his pecuniary interests. Maybe he's not just interested in a financial deal. Maybe there are things like culture and history and imperial thoughts that are driving him. And so we have to put in place a pressure campaign to try to get the Russians to move, or if not, to weaken them sufficiently to where Ukraine can get an enduring peace.
Eric, have you joined us, Eric?
I have joined you. I apologize for being late. Peter, it's great to hear you.
Hi, Eric.
So here I'm speaking to you from our nation's capital. So this recent drone strike deep inside Russia that the Ukrainians carried out, destroying significant parts of apparently the Russian Air Force. Can you speak to how meaningful that is, why it matters, and where do you think the consequences of that will be?
I think it's dramatically important for several reasons. For one, these are the air systems that the Russians have used to launch so-called standoff strikes, which Ukraine has struggled to intercept, and for which it has too few interceptors. And so by going to the airplanes themselves while they're still parked on the tarmac and taking them out, it significantly degrades Russia's ability to inflict terror on Ukrainian cities and to hit frontline positions with these large lumbering standoff systems, because these are airplanes that will fly far away from Ukraine but launch from there, and Ukraine hasn't had a great answer on intercepting those systems. Secondly, it's important because it boosts Ukrainian morale. It shows that they're very much so in the fight and that they can counterpunch. It also matters for the politics of the United States, quite frankly. I think it really weakens the arguments of those who say we should throw in the towel on Ukraine because they're destined to lose anyways. What's the point? What can we actually accomplish? And here the Ukrainians are showing that through their own ingenuity and grit and creativity, they're able to launch really a masterful operation that has really inflicted serious pain on Russian military operations. So I think those are all hugely important elements of why this strike mattered a lot, and it probably weakens the arguments of those in Washington who will say we should cut off assistance, and it probably strengthens the hands of those who say we should continue supporting Ukraine.
Go ahead, Eric.
Just to pick up on the point about those in Washington who want to abandon Ukraine, is there anyone in particular or any group in particular that has the president's ear or is in the inner circle that you're aware of that is making that argument? And if they are, how effective they are being?
Well, I think the argument isn't put as crudely or maybe as directly as I just made it to abandon Ukraine, or maybe the way you phrased it. But I think there are different sets of arguments that are being made, which I think are making their way to the president. One is that we have a major looming security crisis in the Indo-Pacific. Secretary Hegseth in Singapore just this week spoke about a potential imminent war in Asia. He's not saying it's going to take place necessarily, but war could be imminent, for example, over Taiwan. So in that scenario, if we're going to have a major military support system in place for Ukraine while at the same time having to fight against China over Taiwan, should we choose to do so, it really begins to strain our resources and our abilities and our quite frankly, our defense industrial base's ability to sustain two efforts like that. One, which we would be directly involved in, of course, as active combatants, but the other one still supporting Ukraine. And then I think, aside from those groups of advisors who think a lot about China and America's forward presence there in the Indo-Pacific in particular, there's others who I think just believe America should come home more, should pull up the bridges. We've been at war for a long time with what are arguably failed wars in Iraq and definitely in Afghanistan, and all of that I think has caused people to lose confidence in America's ability to project power. And once that, I think, basic fundamental tenet takes hold, it's basically an argument for this is worthless, this is hopeless, and America can't project power effectively. And I don't think it's any secret who has been making some of those arguments. There is almost sort of a new elite forming in parts of the Republican Party. Tulsi Gabbard is the DNI. She's relatively young. There are others who are next generation leaders who would probably nod along as I say America should come home more rather than try to project power abroad.
Jesse.
Peter, thank you for your service to our country in the Bush administration, Bush 43. But I wanted to just, before I ask you my question on Russia and Ukraine, I wanted to just ask you about your role and the experience of assisting President Bush with his memoir, Decision Point. I think this would be interesting to our readers because they never to get within that room, that writer's room, peel back the curtain to see how that experience is, how that comes to be. The give and take between the president and yourself and others who may have assisted him in writing that outstanding memoir, which I own. Can you just touch upon that a little bit before I just ask you a quick question about Russia and Ukraine?
Sure. So the President Bush, George W. Bush, was a kind of ravenous consumer of biographies and just read a lot, period. And I think as you look through the presidential histories and autobiographies, he ultimately, of course, the gold standard is Ulysses S. Grant's autobiography, but he ultimately landed on a framework of rather than writing a memoir in the classical sense, I was born here in this state all the way up to the present moment. He instead decided to write his memoirs around key decisions that he took in his life, both in his personal and public service life. And basically what he would do is every day he would write after he might be prompted by one of us, what was your 9/11 like? How do you think about education policy? What was your relationship with Tony Blair? Sort of offhand, almost questions like this. And then he would write on all of this. And then we worked to stitch it all together into kind of around these key decisions. And I spent a lot of time in the archives and reading decision memos and looking at notes that key aides took in their notebooks. And so I'm very proud to say if you go down to the presidential archives in Dallas for the George W. Bush administration, I am researcher number one. I think I was the first one to sign into the archives.
Is that your name? Researcher number one? Is that how you're identified?
Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Hey, that's like the first chair, isn't it? An orchestra?
Well, the disadvantage is that it wasn't very well organized yet, so it was pretty difficult to get stuff. But anyway.
Jesse, I have a question about Ukraine.
Yeah, to pick up on actually what Eric talked about in the drone strike, with everything that we've seen with Russia and its military force, has Russia, in these last 3 years in its battle with Ukraine, lost its luster as a superpower or its influence everywhere? Because this is a 3-year war going on 3 years. Most conventional wisdom, when they first occurred in March of 3 years ago, expected the Ukraine to be defeat would be swift. And during that course, Russia needed to rely on partners like China, North Korea, Iran for soldiers, for technology, for armaments and other technology. And this drone strike that seemed to have taken out their ability to fire into Ukraine from afar, as you described. How are world leaders and world military experts now looking at Russia and its military capabilities?
Well, I would neither exaggerate nor underestimate the Russians. On the one hand, they are suffering these enormous battlefield casualties, some 1,500 a day, and when they're really in high tempo operations, sometimes slightly even more than that. But they are learning along the way, and I think their willingness to stomach those sorts of losses is somewhat intimidating in and of itself. We lost thousands of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, but nowhere near the numbers that the Russians are suffering, even on a monthly basis. And yet it really caused, political tremors and earthquakes in American life and American politics. So for the Russians to do this, to push, makes one worry that if they did launch a major war with NATO and European nations were involved in the fighting, do we have the stomach, to beat that back? Secondly, I would say that one shouldn't misread the Ukrainians. They're not a NATO member state, but they are by landmass the largest country in Europe, and a pre-war population of 40 million ranks them up pretty high. They've also had a decent defense industrial base left over as a vestige and a legacy of the Cold War. So they had some capabilities at their own disposal. And I felt this in months and years leading up to the war, of all the Europeans who would come through Hudson Institute, and we regularly have delegations from across the continent, the Ukrainians really do have an esprit de corps and a sense of pride, and there's a nationalism there that ranks near the top. And so that mixture means that Ukraine actually proved to be a really formidable target that the Russians and that Vladimir Putin put in his crosshairs. And, it's sort of stunning, given that it's the country he might know best of all of the European countries, that he so fundamentally misread how they would react to the war. He thought through a simple thunder run to Kyiv, he could get basically the government to crumble and the population to flip. And none of that, of course, proved to be true. Moreover, the Russians have basically now gone to a defense wartime economy. And so they are rapidly trying to re-equip and rebuild their armed forces or build in new directions. And they are probably learning lessons quicker than we are in the West, because it's very hard to learn at the same pace as somebody who's a combatant in combat. So you're right. I mean, there is a basic weakness there. I have no doubt if we ended up at war with Russia that the West would win. But there's something worrying there. I do think some of their defense customers around the world. I mean, the Russians don't export a lot. They export oil and gas. They export vodka, caviar, and then basically weapon systems. And I do think, given how badly they need their own defense production to service their own military, that there's an opportunity to pick off here or there some of their defense customers who might also be less than impressed by how Russian kit has performed in the war. So there are opportunities there, but Russia, I think, still is a pretty serious and significant opponent.
Peter, on behalf of Chairman Garcia, Eric Levine, and myself, we want to thank you for being on Let the Record Show. This has been a very compelling and interesting conversation. Your insights and your analysis are just absolutely wonderful. And I think this war is going to go on for a while. So on behalf of Jesse and Eric and myself, we're going to be bringing you back probably for a play-by-play, if that's acceptable to you.
I'd be delighted to do that. And thank you, gentlemen. The pleasure was really all mine.
Okay. This has been Let the Record Show. We've been delighted to have Peter Rowe of the Hudson Institute, expert on foreign policy and national security, with a real expertise on Europe, as our guest. On behalf of Jesse, Eric, and myself, God bless you, God bless your families, and of course, God bless America. Look forward to being with you again next week on Let the Record Show. Thank you for listening.